All right. Well, good afternoon, members, friends, and new listeners of the Global Justice Report. I apologize for a rather rough takeoff here and a few minutes late. But I'm Cliff Durand, host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice is a multinational and bilingual research center in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world. Since 2004, when we were founded, we've offered educational programs in English for expats and visitors, and programs in Spanish for the Mexican community. We've also organized educational travel to Chiapas and to Cuba. Our vision is to move control of economic life and relations with Mother Earth from the 1% to the 99%. Coronavirus has set in relief the failures of neoliberal capitalism. Our weekly Global Justice Report will explore various grassroots democratic solutions, including self-management, cooperatives, mutual aid, public banking, and more. If you have suggestions for future webinars, please uh, send your ideas to us. Our program today is on racism and identity. And if you have questions for our speakers, you can get them to the speakers by sending me an email. We've had a lot of trouble using the chat box. People have trouble getting their questions up in chat box. So we're going to try a different method today. If you have questions, you simply shoot an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And I will monitor that email coming in. And at the ends of the presentations, we'll then present questions to our speakers. The problem of racism has captured public attention in the United States as tens of thousands of protesters fill the streets of every major city and many small towns as well. Largely peaceful protesters, black and white, have persisted day after day, week after week, demanding systemic racism must end. And it's not just police violence against blacks, but racism in all aspects of the society that treat people of color unfairly so as to keep them at the bottom of society. The country is being called to a reckoning with its history. The fact of the matter is that the United States was founded as a white nation. And while the society has gone on to become multicultural, including blacks, Native Americans, and various ethnic groups, they never enjoyed equal status. The mindset of a large number of USians remains white still today. Racism is not only built into the institutions of society, it is also built into the identity of whiteness. The racism of this white identity is now being challenged by the Black Lives Matter movement. What does it mean to be white? How is this white identity constituted? And how does it lead to denial of an equal humanity to the other? We need a soul-searching critique of whiteness if we are to ever overcome racism. Today, we are privileged to have two philosophers to help us in this reflection. Charles Mills, author of The Racial Contract, and Linda Alcoff, author of The Future of Whiteness, as well as many other books. Charles teaches at the City University of New York Graduate Center and has published a number of books besides his groundbreaking book, The Racial Contract. He has been a leading thinker on a critique of racial liberalism. He will be our second speaker. We will lead off with Linda Alcoff, who teaches at Hunter College. She has written many books on questions of race, gender, class, and national identities. The title that sort of captured my attention for this webinar is The Future of Whiteness. Her latest book is Rape and Resistance. So we will lead off with Linda for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then go to Charles. And after that, we will entertain questions that you send to my email, global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. Okay, let me hand the floor now to Linda Alcoff.
Thank you, Cliff. It's really nice to see you again after so many years. And I wish I could be with some of you in Mexico right now, but it's impossible. So in my portion of this event, I'm going to make two related points. Both of them are primarily concerned with white racial identity, and my analysis here is principally drawn from the case of the United States. I think whiteness is a global phenomena, and there are commonalities in some cases around the globe of whiteness. We can talk about that perhaps in Q&A. But we need to understand all of these identities as very much having local elements to them. So I think despite the fact that there's some global commonalities, the richest political analysis of any racial identity is one that will be informed by the specific local conditions. So I'm going to make two claims. One is in the first section that whiteness is better understood as a historical construction rather than, as it's often understood, a social construction. The two are not entirely different, but I think the language of history is really important. And second, I'm going to argue, given this understanding of whiteness, in order to enlarge racial solidarity, we need to understand the obstacles to solidarity as more structural than attitudinal. So I'll spend some time on that. And before I begin, let me just say I come to this topic as someone with a mixed heritage. My mother is white while my father was brown. I'm an immigrant to the United States from Central America. I traveled to the United States as a small child and stayed. My mother's family is Southern and poor, and my father's family was more middle class. And these experiences from an early age taught me to see race concepts as social rather than as natural kinds, because they operate very differently in different contexts. And I also was led to understand that the way racial identities work in one country is not necessarily the way they work in another country. So let me begin with the question of whiteness as a historical construction. Whiteness studies that emerged in the 1990s helpfully brought the contours of white racial identity into relief. So there's now an empirical reality to white identity that we can find easily, that includes wages and wealth, housing and healthcare, voting patterns, fertility rates, suicide rates, mortality rates. So we can compare these to other groups. So we can now map whiteness, we can measure it, we can locate it, and we can date it. So empirical whiteness is a measurable object in the world. But still, of course, the empirical realities of whiteness can be misleading. The average wage and wealth across the big category of whiteness conceals the fact that many, many whites are poor or near poverty. The percentages of whites in poverty are lower than the percentages for Black and brown folks in particular, but the real numbers are high. There are 18 million whites in the United States who are desperately poor, which is the same number of people of color added together. So the coalition would be half white of poor people. The category of the near poor, which includes those who live paycheck to paycheck and generally have no health insurance, and most of us would consider the near poor pretty poor, they're similar. And this is a large constituency estimated between 31 and 41 million people. So this is the empirical reality. You have significant differences between the category of whites and other groups, but you also have significant internal differences as well. Now, I think it's useful to talk also about imaginary whiteness, which operates differently to span across these material differences. And by imaginary whiteness, I mean the way whiteness is imagined, as, for example, hardworking, honest, with intact families, and largely innocent of racist wrongdoing. There are both explicit and implicit forms of imaginary whiteness. There's explicit ideologies of white supremacy galore. I know Charles Mills will speak about that. But there's also implicit ways of imagining whiteness that never explicitly invoke the term, yet are very powerful. And imaginary whiteness works to validate racist policies, create hegemony, and disable effective communication and negotiation. So it can make whiteness the defining, the controlling term. One example is just unemployment. When you have very high rates of unemployment among Black and brown folks in the United States, it's not called an economic crisis. Not until those unemployment rates reach the white community, and then the front page of the Wall Street Journal says, we have an economic crisis. So whiteness is not said explicitly there, but it is the controlling term determining when the concept of crisis is invoked, right? The result of empirical realities and powerful imaginaries is to produce a form of subjectivity marked by whiteness. And this has actually been subject to a lot of empirical experiments as well for some decades by social psychologists like Claude Steele. These experiments reveal a distinct content to white subjectivity. Now, it's not universal to all whites, of course, but it's still statistically significant. And this content includes different ways of interacting with non-whites versus whites, problematic perceptual assessments, such as the fact that whites will significantly overestimate how many non-white people are in a room, a classroom, or a business office, and habits of hostility and of entitlement, the sense of entitlement to space, a sense of entitlement to any neighborhood they want to move into, the sense of entitlement to resources, attention, and protection from the police, for example. So how should we understand then this empirically measurable object, whiteness? How did it come into existence? How is it maintained in existence? And how can we set aside the many significant internal differences to talk about whiteness as a unified category? One of the obvious problems with talking about whiteness is this problem of, as the Greeks put it, the one in the many. How can a thing, which is a many, also be a one? And, you know, I do want to stress here, whiteness is not monolithic. It runs from Trump towers to trailer parks, from city snobs to rural militias, including gay and trans and women and children. But the question of our day is, why don't these mediations of whiteness lead to more significant conflict within the category? The content that makes up this unified field of whiteness has largely to do with the history of whiteness, which is a history of immigration from Europe. Whiteness is not altogether an illusion. It's not simply a false claim. It's a useful word to capture a shared social experience and ongoing reality. Most of European immigration was motivated for the same reasons that motivate Guatemalans today to come to the US: desperation. The European landed gentry did not send its youth away, never to be seen again. The poor and the persecuted, however, often had no choice. So over the centuries, this economically motivated migration created a shared historical experience, a lore about the hardships shared among families with elements in common despite the many differences within and among the waves. What was largely shared was a sense of happy escape from famines, poorhouses, pogroms. Also, what was shared was their reception in the United States. Whites were welcomed with important political set-asides and labor advantages. First and foremost was citizenship. Congress passed a naturalization law in 1790 in which, quote, any alien can petition to become a citizen if they are a free white person of good character, unquote. Now note that the person had to be both white and free, and thus it excluded indentured servants. But this law nonetheless helped to cement the category of whiteness and enforce its political advantages over others. And it also created a category of other than white, engendering a century of legal battles about where to place that borderline, who to include and who to exclude. Why were only whites allowed to become citizens? In terms of ideation or imaginary whiteness, white European immigrants were from the beginning seen differently in ways that still mark our political culture, enabling American exceptionalism by portraying white settlers as hardworking and deserving. They were European and thus of superior stock, but importantly, and this I want to stress, they were also happy to be free of the old European ways that had driven them out. Thus, they were ideal citizens. They were committed without equivocation to the new society in the making. They were disinterested in maintaining their ties to previous nations. They were unmotivated for a long time in having any hyphenated identities. And they were ready to amalgamate across ethnic, if not racial, lines, so lots of intermarrying. White identities were not encumbered by grievances against the US state because of slavery or colonialism. Their experience of immigration and their motivations for immigration set them apart. And as the only group initially allowed to become citizens, they enjoyed a plethora of racial set-asides, from homesteading rights to labor rights to political rights. So I think it's important that we understand how this shared experience produced a specific sense of identity and relationship to the state. To conclude this section, I want to say that the importance of using the historically constructed language rather than social construction is that it helps avoid too easy solutions. What has been socially constructed, some have argued, can be easily deconstructed. And there's nations around the world, like France and Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, that have disallowed the statistics gathering of racial groups. They don't want any official government document to mention or sort of bring into existence racial groups. But if we understand racial groups as historically constructed, then we understand they're not so easy to simply wish out of existence. This brings me to the question of solidarity that I want to do in the next and final section. So in order to chart a way forward, we need to understand the potentiality of alliances across racial groups and how these alliances have been systematically blocked through the history of the United States by legalized racism that privileged whites over others, citizens over others, and professionals over others. The labor movement's dismal history of racism in which some of the unions wrote segregation into their own organizational contracts through the 1960s, might be understood as a form of white protectionism, since the price of those economic advantages for whites was refusing solidarity with Black and other workers. So given this history, we need to understand the obstacles to solidarity as more structural than attitudinal. Economic nationalism has also roped the interests of all US workers with citizenship papers to US capital, thus undermining the potential transnational lines of solidarity as well as solidarity with more recent immigrants in the United States. Many unions broke with economic nationalism starting in the 1980s. They broke their ties with the CIA because they recognized that to organize the actual existing working class in the US, you had to redress anti-Latino racism, anti-Asian racism, and anti-immigrant sentiments, or these workers would not join the union or get involved. The economic nationalism that Trump has certainly promoted is a structural block to solidarity that pits the material interests of US workers of all races on the one hand against immigrant workers, undocumented workers, and workers outside the United States. So the history of right to work laws that now operate in 28 states in the United States and have hobbled the workers' movement, we need to remember began as a strategy of segregation so that white workers would not be required to belong to integrated unions. And this helped to create the view that the interests of white workers were better met in white-only unions, and there would be a social cost, if not an economic cost, for white workers who went against segregation. Today, the rationalizations of right-to-work laws have morphed into a neoliberal individualism, but this is not separate from race. The architects of right-to-work, the Koch brothers et al., are the same architects of voter suppression and the privatization of education. They said, it's not about opposing integration, but allowing for voluntary segregation. That's the kind of language that's used today. But let me turn to what we're witnessing in the last 2 months since the lynching of George Floyd in late May. We have a new era of cross-racial solidarity. So I want to ask, how do we understand this? 65% of Americans in recent polls support Black Lives Matter. Majorities of white, Latinx, and Asian American populations support the recent upsurge. This solidarity shows signs of strength and endurance, since what it really continues a trend that has been going over the last 2 decades, in which opinion polls and others show changed views about opinion polls of whites and others show changed views about the continuing significance of anti-Black racism. So about half of white people today agree with people of color and Black folks most of the time in regard to the role of racism in the carceral system, the fact that the police do more harm than good in Black and brown communities, the racism of employment. And this is not just an urban phenomena. There's also, there's been demonstrations of white people in support of Black Lives Matter in rural areas across the country and in small towns. How does class figure here? I want to raise. Surveys reported by the New York Times indicate that the white protesters in the recent upsurge are mostly middle class and college educated. Why is this? And I think the answer has 2 parts. First, we can give credit to Africana studies, Latin American studies, Black studies, and other such curricula developments in higher education, as well as high schools. The population of college-educated youth is not quite as ignorant about historical realities as my generation was. We had to do reading on the side. Du Bois was never assigned reading. Second, however, we also need to acknowledge that the liberal and most of the radical intelligentsia have abandoned the white poor and white workers to the right wing. They are considered the true deplorables beyond redemption. And I want to argue here that this negative and even fatalistic assessment is the result of focusing on attitudinal issues over social position. The middle-class whites who support Black Lives Matter largely have a secure income base. Most do not feel the need for an economic nationalist agenda. Yet this class of whites may well have the most to lose if intergenerational wealth transfers are threatened by serious reparations agendas, or gentrification is regulated, or the increased wage scale for workers they rely on reduces their comfortable lifestyles. An understanding of structural racism must be accompanied by an analysis of structural solidarity, by which I mean the effects of structural racism on the possibilities of sustained and meaningful solidarity. So the most critical question of solidarity is largely ignored by the liberal and radical intelligentsia. And that is the question, where are the white workers here? Where are the white poor in these demonstrations? And who's thinking about this? I have two examples for you of people who are thinking about this. One is the Poor People's Campaign, begun here in North Carolina, where I'm speaking from, and some parts of the labor movement. The Poor People's Campaign is heir to the campaign of the same name that Martin Luther King had just launched when he was assassinated in 1968. The Poor People's Campaign today, led by Reverend William Barber, organizes walkouts, protests, marches, conferences, central agenda items, including single-payer health care, end to mass incarceration, protection of the right to vote, living wage laws. But I think what's most interesting about it for our purposes is its effort to link diverse movements that take up different issues around racism, sexism, ableism, LGBTQ issues, and Native American issues, and class. And what they call this fusion politics. So the idea of fusion is not to lump everyone together, but to understand that you cannot fight for economic justice without tackling structural racism, as well as other identity-based forms of oppression that expand exploitation possibilities while disabling solidarity. The Poor People's Strike, supported by a lot of unions, including SEIU and Unite Here, seeks to incorporate the white poor and white workers, and they address the white poor and white workers directly and overtly in their rhetoric as well as their actions. So I think if we apply this kind of a approach to solidarity, to the critical question of the potential of lasting solidarity, there are two lessons here. First is we need to really disaggregate white people in terms of class and other dimensions of social position, and I'll explain. And second, we need to move away from the focus on individual attitudinal change as decisive, and instead look at existing movements that may be able to create shared agendas and fused social actions. Poor whites, of course, are more likely to be affected by racism, unable to live in wealthier neighborhoods with better social services, affected by racist real estate markets if they're lucky enough to own a home, more likely to work in workplaces dominated by people of color. Examples include nursing home workers, aides, dietary, janitors, domestic workers, garment industry, food production, farm labor, public schools, especially non-teaching, and transportation. In the Detroit nursing home, staffed mostly by Black workers, for example, that only have 10 to 20% white workers, the wages are well below a living wage, so that workers are unable to afford the health care offered to them by employers. They have no paid sick days, and during the pandemic, they have been endangered and some have died because COVID patients were placed in the nursing homes without the staff being told and without being given sufficient protective equipment. But these material interests, as we know, are not enough to create solidarity. What I want to argue here, and I'm almost done, is that the Poor People's Campaign and the labor movement offer not only ways to think about material interests, but opportunities to create experiences of solidarity in real world struggles. According to Joe Fagan and other sociologists of racism, overcoming racist views is best achieved through two elements. One is you have to have relationships face to face, characterized by equality and not just master-servant relations. But also you need to have shared projects of work or activities such as contract negotiations or strikes in which different groups must work together. The opportunity for shared projects requires going against the professionalization language of some unions, some nurses and teachers unions, for example, in which the claim to higher wages, the right to have higher wages is staked to having a professional, highly educated, skilled status, making them harder to replace and thus more empowered to demand more. The slogan of National Nurses United, for example, is that RN equals real nurse, marking them as distinct and superior to nurse aides and LPNs. These professional unions have lately been very strong on social issues, but in their workplace agenda, they have focused narrowly on protecting the most elite, mostly white workers. Their unions do not include the non-professionals. And their arguments make use of a noxious market logic. It has little to do with the difficulty of jobs, the danger of jobs, or their social value. Since the pandemic began, the largely invisibilized workforce in food production, healthcare, sanitation, and transportation has been made more visible and designated essential, even while they are treated as expendable by concrete policies. And this is the workforce that's so racially diverse, as we know. So on July 20th, just a couple of weeks ago, several unions across the United States organized a 1-hour strike of workers in essential industries, from fast food to nursing homes. The strike was named the Strike for Black Lives, and it was linked to the current upsurge. So this was a strike for Black lives, but it was all workers in fast food and nursing homes and other essential industries and healthcare and so forth. Although the turnout was huge, it was almost ignored by the corporate press, but the organizing that went into it was the most significant element. It allowed conversations in contract committees, strike committees, union meetings about why the strike was linked to Black Lives Matter, why it was in the interest of white workers, among others, to make this link and support the upsurge. In the 24 Detroit nursing homes facing contract battles right now, it was an easy conversation to have. Having a workforce that is 90% Black drives down wages and working conditions for all. In Minnesota nursing homes, the conversation was different. There in suburban Minneapolis, where the workforce is majority white, it will take more than one conversation to build a fusion with anti-racist struggle. But I want to argue this is where our focus should be. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Linda. A lot to chew on there. And if our viewers have any questions that you'd like to pose for Linda, you can get them to her by sending them in an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And at the end of the next presentation, I'll present your questions or comments to Linda. But now let's move on to Charles Mills, who needs to unmute his microphone. And I will give the floor to Charles now.
Well, first, thanks first of all to Cliff for the invitation. Great to be here. And I think, what you guys are doing is really important. I'm going to give a presentation based on an article I did. One of the advantages of the present time period is that there's so much more self-consciousness about issues of race and racism, and that for some time, philosophers, a minority of philosophers, Linda and myself, among many others, have begun to take up these issues. And this is a welcome change, what would have been the case a few decades ago, when this was very much a fringe, a minority subject, was not taken seriously by the mainstream of the profession. And even though we're not sort of in a central concern yet, we've certainly moved significantly from the margins towards the center. And one manifestation of that is that you're now beginning to get companions and guidebooks to the issues of philosophy and race. And it would have been inappropriate for Linda to do so, but I can do so. I'm going to plug for the audience, I hope it's not too far, the Routledge Companion to Philosophy of Race, co-edited by Linda, among others. This came out about 2 years ago. And this is an indication, as I said, of the fact that these issues are now seen as legitimate philosophical ones. And my chapter in this companion was on white supremacy. And white supremacy is a term that we've heard quite a bit about lately, but that we would not have heard very much of in previous years because it was seen to have been a particular stage long since past. So white supremacy, for example, would be seen as applying to the US South, to apartheid South Africa, but certainly not to the United States, let's say, of the post-war period, or for some people, even going back further than that. And one of the things that philosophers do in the analytic tradition is to sort of take a term and say, what's a useful way of analyzing this term in a fashion that sort of captures crucial realities so that you maintain a certain continuity with the everyday sense of the term, but in addition, there might be a bit of conceptual revision, because you might think that the common sense concept of the term is inadequate in certain ways. There's even a phrase for this in the analytic tradition, conceptual engineering. So in my contribution to this handbook that Linda co-edited, I decided to take the term white supremacy and say, what would be a useful analysis of this term that would link up with the everyday sense, but would perhaps modify it in crucial ways to capture realities that perhaps a common sense usage of the term does not. So one of the things I'm going to do, and viewers might find this in a sort of challenge, is I'm going to outline what I see as 5 crucial characteristics of white supremacy. And maybe one of the questions people could ask is, well, does that really work? Do we sort of want to operate with an expanded and engineered concept like that? Or maybe is your engineering itself inadequate in various ways? So I should specify from the start that there's a crucial ambiguity in the term, because white supremacy is often used to denote a set of ideas and values. You speak of somebody as being a white supremacist, and they're committed to a certain way of looking at the world, a particular racist way of looking at the world. And though I recognize that usage of white supremacy, I'm focusing on a different usage. The usage I'm focusing on is the social structural one. So that, in a sense, links up with Linda's point in her presentation that in understanding these issues of race and identity, it's a mistake to focus solely on the attitudinal level, on what attitudes and beliefs people have. We also need to look at broader social structures. So the conceptual analysis I'm giving of white supremacy is of white supremacy as a social system, okay? Not white supremacy as a set of ideas primarily, but as a social system. And the claim I'm making, what I'm suggesting is that we need to add this term to the vocabulary of social theory, of political philosophy, of political science. And the absence of this term in sort of mainstream sociology, mainstream political science, except you might say in terms of recent changes, has hindered these disciplines in terms of giving them an adequate understanding of the world. Okay, so here's my 5-point characterization of white supremacy. Remember, as I said, not as a set of ideas, but as a social system. Number 1, white supremacy is a particular kind of oppressive social system that could be subnational, that could be national or could even be international, okay? So, the scope of white supremacy I'm suggesting could be much broader than standardly assumed. Number two, white supremacy I'm suggesting comes into existence, and this links up with Linda's argument for the historical treatment of whiteness in a period in which race has emerged as a significant social category and a social reality. Now, as we shouldn't assume that white supremacy is trans-historical, all times and all places, we need to historicize it. Point number three, white supremacy can only arise when whiteness and non-whiteness have also emerged as social identities. Because you could have race emerging, but whiteness is not yet part of the picture. Point number four, I would argue, that a crucial dimension of white supremacy as a social system is that whites as a group have differential power in creating the system, in shaping the evolution of the system, and that they exercise that power. And that the point of the exercise of this power is to privilege whites at the expense of people of color. And then finally, point number five, I actually sort of went ahead, I merged 4 and 5. So that, yes, so 5 is that white supremacy, the argument would be, is characterized by the differential advantaging, the differential privileging of whites with respect to people of color. Okay, guys? So 5 crucial points. So let's now go over them. So point number 1, what do I mean by saying white supremacy could be not just national, but international? Well, as I say, the normal use of the term is pretty restricted. It's restricted, for example, to the American Old South. It's restricted, let us say, to apartheid South Africa. But think of the fact that 100 years ago, in 1920, most of the world was occupied by the European colonial empires. Now, the nations we now recognize, the post-war period, it's almost, I think, 200. Most of these nations were not independent because most of the world was, covered by the European colonial empires, British, French, Dutch, and so forth. And European colonialism, European imperialism is in part a system of racial domination. Now, as race and racism were not incidental to these political systems, they were the fundamental rationale. It was because Europeans were seen as racially superior, that's what justified their rule over other peoples, the idea being that we are the superior race, we have the superior culture, we're going to lead you to civilization insofar as that's possible, and that's going to require on your part, if you're capable of it, assimilating to European culture. So you can make a case, I'm suggesting, that you go back 100 years in the period of European colonial domination of the planet. I'm suggesting you could see white supremacy in effect as global, in that in all these empires, the presumption was that whites are superior, whether because of biology, whether because of culture, whether because of both. So if this is a sort of useful way to think of things, then what we need to ask ourselves is, what would the legacy of this system have been? So obviously after World War II, you have mass decolonization, you have the United Nations being filled with Black and brown nations, but this is only a relatively recent development, a few decades ago. So what would the legacy of this system be? And the obvious answer, I would suggest, is that the legacy is a situation where it's still the case that whites are relatively privileged with respect to people of color, both in particular nations and across the planet as a whole, though the difference now is that the privileging is not enforced by law. It's more a matter of material advantage in various ways. And if we think of the global uptake of the Black Lives Matter movement in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, and the fact that these issues resonate, not just people declaring solidarity with Black Americans, but looking at the situation in their own country, in Britain, in France, in the Arab world, in Latin America, then we can see this resonance, this echoing is precisely because of this legacy, the legacy of racial domination, which in many ways lives on, even though it's no longer a matter of formal colonial rule. So in the United States itself, in other European settler states, such as Canada, such as Australia, such as New Zealand, such as obviously, because they were so overtly racist, South Africa, you continue to have a situation where people of color, indigenous peoples, the descendants of Black slaves, or Black indigenous people like in South Africa and so forth, are disadvantaged structurally. And this is why it's so crucial that Linda emphasized that it's not just a matter of bad attitudes, and you as a liberal white person say, well, I've read the appropriate books on the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list. I mean, it's great that, you have so many books on race on the New York Times bestseller list. But, it's not the case that you read these books, I've purged myself, I do the appropriate mea culpas, and now I can go out into the world with my white self, thinking that, I at least, I'm, I have been, cleansed of, these things. I'm not a racist. I've done my bit. And the point is that a system of racial domination has to be dismantled. It's not merely a matter of, purging yourself as an individual of racist, attitudes and beliefs. It's the system that continues to illegitimately privilege whites at the expense of people of color. Okay, then in terms of the historical stuff, number 2 and number 3, I point out that we can't assume that race has always been with us. And there's been an interesting set of debates in the scholarly community of people who work on race. And this is much wider than philosophers, much wider than political scientists. It's also people in classics. It's also people in medieval studies. And a standard analysis of when race comes into the world that you used to find in particular in left circles was that race is a product of modernity. So Europeans go out into the world, European imperialism, European colonialism, European settler states, racial slavery, and then race emerges in this period as basically a rationale for European domination. Because at the same time period, when you're getting liberal political philosophy born, which emphasize equality, so how can equality coexist with white settler states, racial slavery, European colonialism and imperialism? The way it coexists is because racism says different set of rules for whites than for people of color. People of color are not equal. Therefore, the liberalization you have in Europe doesn't extend to them. So you can see why that narrative has a definite force and attractiveness. But you were getting an emergent body of scholarship, both in medieval studies and in classics, that is undermining it. They're important books. There's a book by a medieval theorist called Geraldine Heng, The Origins of Race in the European Middle Ages. And her argument is that you get race from at least medieval period, because in Christian iconography, you have what are called the monstrous races. And the monstrous races cover clearly fanciful beings, like giants and one-legged beings and so forth. But you also have human beings, including the monstrous races. You have Jews, you have Muslims, you have Ethiopians, was a general term for blacks, you have Mongols, you have what are called Skraelings, North American Indians, you have Gypsies. And Heng's argument is that what you're getting here is medieval racialization of the population. So that even if modern race is to a certain extent different, it's not the case that it's race coming to the world for the first time, and that you have a pre-modern medieval race. And that many of the sort of modern racial categorizations, for example, of blacks, for example, of Muslims and is Islamophobia, pick up on the medieval ones. And there's an argument from some people in classics that actually it's even older, and that you have race from the ancient world, and that Aristotle, famous, in the Western tradition, one of the sort of most important philosopher in the West, he is giving us a racist analysis insofar as he has this category of the natural slave, and natural slaves, it turns out, are non-Greeks like Persians. So if this analysis is vindicated, it would mean that race and racial exclusion are not just a product of the modern period, they've been deeply embedded in the West cultural tradition, the West political tradition, going all the way back 2,500 years, to this period, in the ancient world. So if that's correct, then the implications are kind of ominous, because it means that race is far more deeply embedded in the Western tradition than one would like to think. And it means that getting rid of race is correspondingly going to be much more of a struggle. Okay, so then moving on, I then argue that, let's say this analysis is correct and you have pre-modern race. Do you have whiteness in the pre-modern period? And these people are not generally saying that you have whiteness as yet. You have, the categories of Europeans as compared to sort of these people are seen as, in various ways, non-European and alien, but whiteness is rarely a product of the modern period. So you could say that the modern period still has a crucial role in establishing race, in that it does establish whiteness, even if there's pre-modern racial categorizations. And what it also does is globalize a system of racial domination. Heng, for example, argues that it's not merely that you have these racist views in the medieval period, but you also have racial institutions. In particular, she argues that the first racial state in the history of the West is not, as you'd expect in the colonial world, it's actually in medieval Europe. It's 12th to 13th century Britain oppressing its Jewish population. So the argument would be that anti-Semitism is not merely a matter of prejudicial views against Jews and sort of individual persecutions of Jews. She argues that at least some European states, we can say that the state itself is a racial one, an anti-Semitic state. And with modernity, of course, with European voyages of conquest, you then get racial states established all over the world. And David Theo Goldberg, more than a decade ago, wrote a book, The Racial State, arguing that the modern state is racialized, because the modern state is supervising colonial rule, imperial rule, racial slavery, expropriation of indigenous peoples. So by its very nature, it means that there's going to be a differential treatment of Europeans and European settlers in other countries and indigenous peoples. The state is racialized. So within the left tradition, which people are more familiar with, because of course left theory, Marxist theory and its various descendants has been more respected for a long time, there's a category of the class state, the state that basically pretends to be a liberal democratic state, but privileges the bourgeoisie at the expense of the working class. So there's a familiar idea in the Marxist tradition of the bourgeois state. And what I'm suggesting is that we need to sort of recognize, and then a part of the complication will be how do you bring these discourses together? We need to recognize the category of the racial state. When you see the US, Canada, Australia, all these white settler states, and throughout a large part of Latin America as well. And this is going to be more controversial for many Latin theorists, because there's a long tradition going back to sort of the early 20th century, by virtue of which Latin America demarcates itself sharply from the United States. United States, white supremacist nation, segregation, anti-miscegenation law, lynchings, etc. We are racial democracies. So there's the bad El Norte, Los Estados Unidos, those are the bad guys. We're radically different. We're racial democracies. In recent decades, you're beginning to get a body of work which says this is false. You also have a system of white privileging throughout most of the Latin American nations, but it's more subtle. And the classic term that has been coined is pigmentocracy. So it's not a sort of clear-cut white or non-white, with blacks being the most important component of the non-white as in the US. Rather, it's a system of shades where you have whites, you have light-skinned peoples, you have mestizos, you have mulattoes, you have unmixed native peoples, you have unmixed blacks, and there's a hierarchy of privilege, so it's more subtle, but it is nonetheless a system that privileges whites at the expense of people of color. So my case would be that you can argue that you continue to have a system of white supremacy inherited from the casta system in the Spanish territories, but that it's not as crude as in the US, but nonetheless, it does mean there's going to be a color coding in the social hierarchy. So that in a country like Brazil, for example, which it uses sort of criterion for blackness that it uses in the US, you have a sort of huge black population who are barely represented in, the crucial institutions of the country, such as, faculty members, such as, in politics, such as, on television and so forth. So the important thing to understand is that white supremacy is not, in my opinion, to be limited to countries like the US and South Africa. We need to see it as global. We need to see it as a legacy of colonialism, so that even though, as Linda emphasized, which is also crucial, that's going to sort of take different forms in different countries, it would be a mistake to say, we don't have what you have in the US, therefore we don't have a system of white supremacy. I would argue that if you use white supremacy in the looser sense, that basically talks about white privilege with respect to the population, you have it in a global way in the European settler states, and in the former colonial world, you could say it's still present to a certain extent, insofar as all these nations, which are now independent, now have to operate in a world that's dominated by the northern powers, and the northern powers, are disproportionately white. So my argument would be, okay, and I should bring this to a close, that we need to move, or we need to supplement a discourse of race and racism, which is very easy to individualize and make it a matter of personal attitudes. We need to start working in addition with these concepts of white supremacy, with these concepts of structural advantage, which then means that these systems need to be sort of looked at. We need to ask ourselves, what would we have to do to dismantle these systems so that race is not tied to differential privilege and advantage as it currently is around the world as a whole?
Thank you, Charles. Very interesting. Well, we have two very insightful presentations. And again, let me remind you, if you have a question or comment you would like to pass on to either of our speakers, shoot an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And we have the first question that's come in from David Schweikert. He writes, are either of you familiar with the book Ian Haney Lopez, Merge Left, Fusing Race and Class, Winning Elections and Saving America?
It sounds like a book to get, certainly.
Yes.
I will rush out and order it immediately.
He comments, Linda's last suggestion is quite similar to the thesis of the book. The book is aimed at creating an agenda for the Democrats in the upcoming elections. It draws on a lot of polling data. I found it compelling. I wonder what you think. The title of the book again, Merging Left, Fusing Race and Class, Winning Elections and Saving America. Comments from either of you?
Well, I know Ian Haney Lopez's work and this book, and I haven't read the whole thing, but he's been really important figure in sort of critical race studies, because he's done some of the historical work to show how whiteness got used in the law and argued over in the law in regard particularly to Mexican Americans. But his analysis primarily wants to show that it's primarily focused on what could be a middle class agenda. So he's arguing that racism adversely affects the white middle class in significant enough ways that they should re-understand their, they should try to begin to understand structural racism. And I don't think he thinks enough about the broad bottom of the labor pyramid and the kinds of issues. So, the Democratic Party is controlled, one might say strangled, by the Democratic Leadership Council, which ensures, like, they refuse to take up single payer, they refuse Medicare for all, they fought against the Fight for 15, although they grudgingly then began to support it. Hillary Clinton only supported $12 an hour, sort of the tussle for 12 instead of the Fight for 15, we said. And their agenda is really modest, and it's too modest for the poor or for working people. So I think Lopez is absolutely right that you could craft an argument. He crafts an argument and he crafts an agenda that would get white middle class people on board on a lot of issues. But the question is, you know, why don't they go to the more real issues about the wage scale? It's not just equal pay, it's the wage scale for people who work in nursing homes, who do food production, the farm laborers. They are still largely excluded from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I was recently doing research on sexual harassment, and I found out that farm laborers, domestic live-in labor, immigrant, all the undocumented, of course, cannot make sexual harassment claims because they're excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act still. Some states have allowed domestic workers to be included, but not live-in domestic workers. So this is a big part of the workforce. It is a part of the workforce that we all depend on now, as we realize. And it's a part of the workforce that's very racially diverse. And that workforce needs a stronger agenda than the one Haney Lopez is putting forward. So I would like to talk to, I would like, if it's possible, to get David to respond and to tell me what he thinks, because I know he's concerned about this kind of agenda as well.
One of the ironies of this pandemic period is that it's now being recognized that there are essential workers, and the irony is that it is precisely the essential workers that are the lowest paid and most disempowered. Whether that public recognition of how essential they are might become the basis for political pressure from the grassroots to make some of those changes that you suggest, Linda, I don't know, is an important question.
Well, can I just add on to your point? I mean, I think you're pointing to the issue of power and decision making, and that's what's needed. Too often we see racism as kind of a paternalism. We're going to help the racialized members of our society. That's not what's needed. What's needed is power, and that's what's really threatening to the Democratic national leadership. So because if you have an independent voice, and which is independent of the employers, independent of political parties, and that's what you need. You need workers who have an independent voice in the work sites and nationally. That's the only thing that will change things. And that's what, I worry that people like Haney Lopez, as good as he is, doesn't take seriously enough.
If I could just add, I mean, as I say, I've not read the book, but given what Linda has said about it, we also need to look at the role of race in making the United States such a peculiar nation. We've heard a lot about American exceptionalism in various ways. There's American exceptionalism in a very negative way, which is that why is this country, the richest country in the world, why is there such an extreme gap between rich and poor? So the kind of points that Thomas Piketty made a few years ago in terms of saying that we're going to be entering this new Gilded Age, this age of plutocracy. And among the Western nations, I think the US is either at the very top or close to the top in terms of the gap in salaries, in terms of the gap between rich and poor. And the natural question would be, well, why is this? And various reasons have been given historical. Some people have argued that insofar as people in the East had the option of going west, in the process, of course, expropriating Native Americans, of course, but that provided a kind of outlet for workers' pressure. But certainly one factor historically that many people, the Black community have advanced is that white identity, white working class sort of identity and identification with their whiteness, militated against the formation of a strong trade union movement. So that unionization, as I don't need to tell anybody on this panel, unionization is now down to what about like 9% or so. And that you have a situation where the trade union movement was sort of progressively weakened, so that in terms of a countervailing force for a more democratized, more egalitarian capitalist system, you could make a case that race has played a crucial role in that also. So that in the struggle against white domination, and this links up with Linda's last point, it's in white workers' interests, you could argue, to sort of advance this kind of agenda so that you can have a broad transracial movement of the poor, of the unemployed, of the disadvantaged, that would be able to constitute a more powerful countervailing force against capital than has historically been the case. And that, in fact, the formation of plutocracy, and the situation is now so dire that even some mainstream commentators have been using that term. The formation of plutocracy should basically be alert people that these are the times, sort of now more than ever, where there's a objective basis for a coalition of this kind to sort of move the country significantly more in a social democratic direction than it has been historically over its lifetime.
Okay, again, if you have a question, email it to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. Here's another comment from Barbara Applebaum. She writes, there are so many thought-provoking and constructive ideas in your talk. Thank you, both Linda and Charles, for such excellent presentations. One question, however, that arose for me, when you shift the focus from the attitudinal implicit bias, prejudice beliefs, and towards the structural and white supremacy, which I agree is such an important shift, what is the role of the individual habits of whiteness and willful ignorance that perpetuates the structure? This is interesting to me because it would seem that poor whites may also perform habits of whiteness and may be engaged in willful ignorance that may impede solidarity.
Yeah, and Barbara Applebaum has written an excellent book on this, on habits of whiteness, about being good, being white, is I think the title of it. It's a wonderful book. It's really important. I think, what you're detecting, Barbara, some irritation on my part because of the recent focus on attitudes, so it's not that attitudes and habits of whiteness are not critically important. I think that's what all of our work is about, is to try to uncover and unpack and reveal these implicit habits we don't even know that we're doing, that people are not even aware of, try to bring them to consciousness, try to bring them to critical scrutiny, give them some historical analysis. So I think it's critically important, but it's very interesting that in a country like the United States, the mainstream, corporate public sphere launches onto the attitudinal at the expense of other kinds of issues of structural and so forth. And I think that's not a coincidence. So I would say the attitudinal is absolutely critical, but it is in no way sufficient as a means of making real social change. And it can be highly problematic if it is put forward as the sine qua non of anti-racism, right? The sine qua non of the potentiality of solidarity. And I think there's a really excellent book by Shannon Sullivan, another philosopher, called Good White People, which I love, because what she does is she shows how the white poor and the white workers are vilified and demonized constantly by the liberal whites, middle class, to say that's where the racism is, right? It's the white poor, it's the Confederate flag flying, you know, ignorant, uneducated white poor. That's where the racism is. And meanwhile, they go merrily about gentrifying Black neighborhoods, working for horrible multinationals that pay people terrible, taking advantage of the low wages at the bottom of the wage of the labor pyramid to have their comfortable lifestyles, you know, and their participation and benefit from structural racism gets conveniently put off the frame of analysis while we're looking at these damn Confederate flag waving poor people. And it's more complicated than that. I hate the Confederate flag. But you know, we have to think in a more complicated way, long-term and short-term, about how to make social change and about where is the racism? Where is the biggest, who are the biggest racist, and where is the biggest racism occurring? Right now in the US, you're getting all these like full page ads in newspapers from every corporation under the sun, every university under the sun, every museum under the sun, every cultural institution under the sun, expressing their avowed commitments to Black Lives Matter. Meanwhile, you know, business as usual continues. So that's my grouchiness in this period. I should clarify, and thank you, Barbara, for this. I should clarify. I'm not saying habits of whiteness are not important, and there needs to be more and ongoing work to uncover this. And the work that Charles did on the epistemology of ignorance helped all of us begin to think about this. So I'm sure he has some more to say. But I just am saying attitudes are not, they're not sufficient, and they're not even the main problem.
Habits of whiteness, certainly overcoming them, you know, would be a big step. But it depends in part on how we're defining the habits. So the danger is, as Linda's pointed out, of course, Barbara, I'm sure you're perfectly aware of this yourself, the danger is that it then just turns into a product of self-repair. So I have these habits, I mend these habits, I make New Year's resolutions, then I sort of check every month or maybe every year or so, and then whoa, I've cured myself, I'm now a good white person, to use Shannon's term, and now I can sort of go about my business as usual. And you know, the problem is that the habits of whiteness include going along with the structures, and you know, those might not be so readily visible as habits, but you know, that's what sort of keeps the system in place. I mean, if enough white people, you know, rose up and said, these structures are intolerable, they're unjust, they're a violation of American ideals, it means that you know, this system would not have been in place so long. So the habits need to be expanded theoretically, conceptually, to include, you can sort of think of this, what am I doing in everyday life that helps to keep these structures in place? What kind of disruptive habits would I need to develop to contribute towards a movement for reforming these structures, or in some cases where they're beyond reform, for eliminating these structures?
Mm.
While granted that institutional racism is the heart of inequality, it is what hardwires that inequality into the social structure. At the same time, politically, attitudinal racism can be very powerful because it is out of identities that people have, subjective identities that they embrace to define themselves, that it becomes possible for those of similar identities to be mobilized to act together in the political sphere. I think, for example, of the white supremacists that Charles spoke of, in particular the white nationalists that we see now, much more visible in the public space in the United States. And I'd just like to hear either of you to reflect on this very interesting conjuncture of a white identity with a national identity. You know, I'm an American, and being an American means that it is a white country, should be a white country, and these other groups that we perhaps mistakenly allowed to come in and pollute our country, um, they need to be marginalized as much as possible. I mean, that gives rise to a political agenda which reaches, as we well know, into the White House as well as into the halls of Congress and at state and local levels as well. So, any comments about that subjective identification of oneself as a
Obviously,
white person?
but before she speaks, Cliff, you stand up and show the audience your T-shirt.
Oh yes, all right. Um, this is my favorite T-shirt. I don't know if you can see it. It says, "I used to be a white American, but I gave it up in the interest of humanity." I like this T-shirt because it points to the reality that identities may be socially assigned, but one can choose to accept or reject such identities as far as one's self-identification is concerned. One may reject being conceiving of oneself as a white person, but of course, one may still benefit from the white skin privileges. Okay, let's add that into the mix for your comments.
You want to start, Charles? You want to say
No,
something?
no, you're the one who wrote the book on the future of whiteness, not to mention identity philosopher. So you're the one to answer that one.
Well, I'll say something and maybe you can react to it. I mean, I just on this last point, I would say that although we have individual choice, like we can move to Latin America as you did, there's a limit, you know, to our individual ability to choose or unchoose our assigned identities, because obviously in the social world, we're still going to be treated in a certain way and not treated in other ways. So individual choices are obviously limited, as what we need, as you know, are social movements that change the meanings. But I think, you know, I want to agree with you that there is one of the other dangers of sort of orthodox Marxism is making economic motives the most important or the only thing. And I think there is a psychological attachment to whiteness that you see very powerful, in which people will go against their economic interests in order to maintain this sense. And they want to hold on to the monuments, you know, don't take down my monuments, because it's about wanting to maintain this sense of the United States as essentially a good place, essentially a democratic place, had slavery for a little bit, right? But that's a very strong sense of oneself in the world, that the rest of the world is behind, culturally, economically, technologically, morally, politically, philosophically. We're part of the top dog country. And there's a psychological attachment to that that can cause people to join the army and or support military invasions. And I sometimes think that the US military history in the recent period shows evidence of this as well. We've destroyed our economy. We've destroyed our society with these endless wars. Why? It's hard to construct an argument that the endless wars have been in the economic interest of the United States. There's lots of money given to the Pentagon, of course, so that certain sector has benefited enormously, but it's not clear that the warrior culture of the United States today is can be explained entirely by material motivation. So I think, of course, we need to think about the psychological attachments to whiteness. But one last thing I'd say is in terms of voter attitudes, and for example, the vote for Trump, the white vote for Trump, and it wasn't just a white vote for Trump, I think also needs to be understood as responding to his promise to be a nationalist bourgeoisie, right? That the Clintons and others were internationalist bourgeoisies. They were not going to look out for the working class jobs in the United States. They didn't have loyalty in class members of their nation. They were internationalists. And Trump, that the cornerstone of his campaign then and now is the promise, which he did not fulfill, of being a nationalist member of the bourgeoisie, of fighting China. That's what the fight against China is about, because so many of our products come from China and are no longer made in the United States. So that's not just an attitude problem. That's it may be that they overlooked the countervailing evidence about Trump's trustworthiness and any promise he's ever made in his entire life because of their psychological investment in whiteness. But that agenda is a promise of material caretaking for the white working class primarily, but some, other citizens, working class people in the United States. And I think that there's, the sort of attitudinal racism that is completely separate from material interest and social position doesn't play as big a role as we sometimes think it does.
What I'd say, I think Linda could have added because she's written on this herself. So there was, we haven't heard that much about them lately, but Race Traitor used to be a journal. I don't know if the group still exists. And their position was the abolition of the white race. And the problem with such a slogan is it can sort of easily lend itself to misinterpretation. You think of Black Lives Matter and how that was turned into the claim that you're saying only Black people matter, nobody else matters. So that idea. The danger is that though people are progressives put forward the slogan, they know what they mean. As I say, sort of going out into the public sphere, going out into the Twitter universe. So we need to have slogans that don't readily lend themselves to a sort of deliberate misinterpretation. And Linda, as I said, has written on this herself. It might be better to argue for a rethinking of whiteness rather than a giving up of whiteness. In a situation where it's a racialized society, everybody has a race, telling white people, well, you have to give up whiteness. That's not, I think, going to sort of go down that well, apart from being impossible in a sense. And the better line would be, whiteness has historically the sort of dominant forms been tied up with these systems of oppression. But there's also a white anti-imperialist tradition, a white anti-racist tradition, a white progressive tradition. And even though it's been subordinate, it does exist. There are white people who gave their lives for the Black struggle. So a better line of argument would be, let's develop the white anti-racist tradition. Let's reclaim whiteness. Let's develop a competing progressive whiteness that we ultimately hope will displace a whiteness that's linked up with the accommodation to social oppression. And that way you're not telling white people, well, you have to give up your race. You're saying, absolutely, you're white, you're not responsible for this stuff done long before you were born, obviously. But you're here now in this system, which tends to privilege you, though, of course, as Linda emphasized, and particularly true now with, if you think of, people being thrown out, because they can't pay the rent, everything that's coming down right now. how, sort of, to what extent does white privilege at those lower levels still exist? The better way to go is to say, look, you have this particular version of whiteness, which was historically tied up with excluding people of color, and historically tied up with the belief that you could benefit from this. But you can now see it's not working anymore. It was unjust to begin with. And in addition, it's not even working anymore. Why don't we try to develop a revisionist whiteness, a transformed whiteness, which is basically oriented towards reclaiming a United States that's going to be egalitarian and racially just for everybody, so that a progressive whiteness is then part of a rainbow coalition rather than whiteness being excluded from the rainbow.
That brings to mind an issue that I had as I was reading Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. She has a tendency to attack white, liberal whites who enjoy certain white skin privileges, and she attacks them as racist because they accept those privileges, rather than saying, no, those are privileges that everyone should have. They should be available to people of color as well. But she seems to be, blaming people for the privileges that they enjoy. And I think, just like you were suggesting, Charles, politically that's misguided. That does not bring people aboard any social movements for change. Rather, what one should do is say, all right, you are the beneficiary of certain privileges because of the color of your skin. Struggle to extend those privileges to everyone else in society as well, rather than feeling guilty about it, beating up on yourself for it. We have another question here that has come from Ann Ferguson. I agree that solidarity across race requires common projects. What do you say about the importance, not just of trade unions, which, as you say, have a problematic connection to white protectionism, but also tend to be elitist because of seniority concerns that tend to favor white male elites? Rather, we need community organizing groups around such issues as homelessness, healthcare, environmental justice, etc. There's an agenda for you.
Hi, Anne. Yeah, I don't want to, I think all these things are needed, and some are emerging stronger in the pandemic, and we're hoping that they can stay around for a while, mutual aid and so forth. But I think it's, I think another issue with the left is sometimes a real dismissal of the labor movement, and it's really a big mistake. So I don't want to say the labor movement is the only game in town at any stretch, because it's very difficult to operate within for a variety of reasons as a big organization. But it is it's very critical because it reaches beyond the choir, right? A lot of community groups and grassroots groups are made up of the same old white lefty groups, people and lefties of color we see in our communities at all the protests and so forth. So we need, organizations, we need to think about reaching beyond the choir and really organizing at the ground level. And education does that in our classrooms. There's a number of opportunities, but the labor movement is a critical opportunity because it not only allows for political education, it also allows for action. The elitism, organizational structures are not what they were. The Teamsters cleaned themselves up, believe it or not. The largest and most powerful labor unions today are in the United States are made up of women of color, healthcare workers, because they cannot be outsourced to third world countries. This is a stable labor force that you can't move the garment factory, as my old garment factory was, to Taiwan. You have to have service workers of all sorts. And those unions, the transportation unions, the service worker unions, hospitality workers unions, have changed a lot because they've had to. They can't continue with the old white professional, status leading the way, because those people are a minority. The majority of the workers in the United States are women, they're people of color, they're doing service work. So unions were forced to change their strategies, their methods. Now they have all kinds of workshop trainings for shop stewards that include, for example, in DC, I saw recently a workshop training for shop stewards on trans workers, transsexual, transgender workers. They've had to deal with the realities of the workforce, and many of them have become more democratic. So I think the labor movement gets a very bad rap. If you read The Nation magazine, it is really prejudicial, bad coverage. If you read labor notes, you get a very skewed and distorted picture of what's really happening inside of unions today. And so the academics tend to have this view that the labor movement hasn't changed much. And they also have a view that everything needs to be rank and file and everything needs to be grassroots. And that's just not viable. Sometimes you need to have strong grassroots, strong rank and file, but everything doesn't need to be led by the rank and file. If it was all led by the rank and file, there were 30% of union members who voted for Trump in the last election, right? So the rank and file is not always progressive by any stretch of the imagination on any of these social issues. So it's not that the staff is always right either, but you need leadership, and you need leadership to come from the bottom, but you need leadership to provide some guidelines, some framework of analysis for the labor movement to figure out how it can actually move forward, how it can survive, and how it can move forward.
As our time is drawing short, we've suddenly got a flood of questions. So let me just put some of these questions out and let you select which ones to respond to, but respond briefly. Here's a question for Linda from Ernesto Velasquez. How can we, faculty who work within the westernized university and outside of it with movements, concretely dismantle the institutional systemic racism constitutive of the universities where we work? Beyond working to require racism in the curriculum, beyond struggling to make connections between movements and university spaces. And then we have another question from Richard Jones. Frank Wilderson's new book, Afro-Pessimism, insists that since all whites are masters and all blacks slaves, even in interracial marriages, and that blackness is an ineliminable category against which human is defined, what does transformed blackness look like? What is this transformational human? How long do blacks have to wait for this? And let me just put a third one in here from Karsten Struhl on race and identity. Karsten writes, Racial identity is in part the construction of an imaginary community. What kind of a radical social imaginary needs to be constructed in opposition to it? Okay, let's go to some responses, and then we'll return to take up the remaining questions.
Well, perhaps I could reply to Richard's question. I have not yet, I'm actually teaching Africana philosophy this term. So one of my sort of mental notes to myself has been that I need to sort of get up to speed on Afro-pessimism. So I'm not really up to speed yet. But one question I would wonder about is to what extent will this actually historicizes Blackness? None of racial come into existence out of particular social formations. It's true that Blackness is a kind of dubious distinction in that this pre-modern work I mentioned, so in the medieval period you find stigmatization of Ethiopians as demons and sort of linked with Satan, and they're torturers of Christ. And then you can go back to the pagan world, the Greco-Roman world, and there are anti-Ethiopian prejudices there too. So it is unfortunately true that anti-Blackness does really seem to have a long genealogy in the Western tradition that predates. Nonetheless, insofar as we sort of assume that human values can change over time, human attitudes can change, and what it would call for is some kind of united program, some front that would look at this history and make a case to people, including obviously because they're the ones who have these attitudes more saliently, non-Black people, that these attitudes are racist, and these attitudes, you can make a case, they're not in the interest of many people insofar as, and this goes back to the issue of why the US is so strange, why is it so different from other Western nations. If anti-Black racism has been a crucial factor in blocking the development of a transracial egalitarian social movement, then these anti-Black attitudes are not merely morally wrong, but they're against the interests of white people at the lower echelons of the social ladder. So this is a very sort of old project in the left, a sort of attempt to unite Black and white, and it's been done sometimes in a mistaken way, a sort of misguided way, but the project itself is obviously a very worthy one. And what we would have to hope is that Afro-pessimism is mistaken, and that you can get a political project off the ground to tackle anti-Black racism, appealing both to considerations of social justice and insofar as a materialist analysis is valid, appealing also to the group interests of at least some whites.
Linda, do you want to?
That is, but
Linda, do you want to respond to any of those questions just posed?
Just quickly, I think from the question from Ernesto on systemic racism and higher education, he has worked hard on this. As he knows, Charles and I have been our whole career. I think you have to work both inside power structures and outside power structures. Cliff, you're kind of a model for us because you left and you created, creating our own institutions like the Caribbean Philosophy Association and, and these meetings in Cuba that you've organized for so many academics. That's working outside because it's hard to get university money to support efforts like that, right? And I'm part of the Decolonial Institute, which is entirely independent of any institution of higher education. Even though Ramon Grossvogel, who's one of the central players, is from Berkeley, but he doesn't, he understands that we need to be able to make our decisions independently, and in that way create an intellectual space of real ability to bring people together with and without credentials to think through these difficult questions together. The one thing I'd add is I know Ernesto has done some work on these new indigenous universities in Latin America and working class universities, like, for example, in Venezuela. That's something that we briefly did in the United States. I was a part of the Center for Participant Education out of the 60s, in which we were trying to create different kinds of more democratic institutions of education, higher education, but we kind of dropped the ball on that. Latin America took it up, ran with it, and there's lots of positive and negative lessons to learn from that legacy. So I recommend people to read Ernesto Velasquez's piece on this. Maybe you can send it around with the citation information, sort of summing up lessons of an indigenous university in Argentina. And Karsten, you always ask these impossibly large philosophical questions about the social imaginary. The only thing I'd say there is, I like this idea that Charles mentioned of the rainbow that includes whites. And rainbows don't include whites, right? So it kind of reminds us that this is not going to be easy, right? Whiteness doesn't easily fit. It's not one color among other colors. It's always thought of itself as a non-color or a color that includes all other colors or something like that. So, but I think the social imaginary we need is one that will recognize our different histories, different experiences, different positionalities, different identity forms, different material interests, rather than one that sort of, creates this happy image of sameness. And then the question is, how can we create a social imaginary like that in which whiteness could be included? It would have to be a different form of whiteness.
Okay, Jerry Harris, who says, I recently read an article that counterposes white supremacy to racial capitalism and Marxism. How do you view these approaches? And let me put into the hopper another question that came in on the YouTube chat box. It says, oh, no, these are some of the questions that also came to our email. So there are duplications there. And then another question from Ernesto Velasquez. He asks, following Charles' comment about rethinking whiteness, anti-imperialist and anti-racist white traditions of resistance, are there films that you would recommend? Lots of books. How about films on this topic?
That's one I'm not prepared for, so I'm afraid I have nothing that comes to mind immediately. Linda, I'm sure, whose mind is less sort of, not as far on the road to total degeneration as mine is. I'm sure she has some possible ideas.
Well, Charles, I want you to respond to the question about racial capitalism versus.
Sure, okay.
For my sake.
Complicated in the following sense. You can use a white supremacy analysis and recognize that these states are, for the most part, capitalist states. But racial capitalism as a phrase sort of tends.
You cannot be locking the door. This is my house. That's where you have a desk.
Racial capitalism as a phrase sort of imply, okay, you have an explanation. There's a sort of a tacit commitment, an explanation that's going to be able to sort of link it to capitalism as such. Whereas white supremacy for me is more agnostic. In other words, you're sort of leaving it theoretically open. So you recognize this is a system. And then the question is, but what are the origins of the system? Certainly the Marxist explanation, a political economy explanation, that's a potentially very powerful explanation. But there are also explanations, as I say, if you sort of look at racism going back to the pre-modern period, then you can't explain those in terms of racial capitalism, obviously. And you then have the possibility of an explanation that's more cultural. And of course, historically, the left have been skeptical of that kind of pattern explanation. We've seen as idealists rather than materialists. But I think these days we're more aware of the fact that, that sort of classic historical materialism was deficient in various ways. And that, the whole fact you had the new social movements of the 1960s was in part a manifestation of this deficiency, that there were problems in explaining certain kinds of things. And there are sort of deep psychological dimensions to race and racism. You think of the rituals of lynching, for example, sort of tortures and castrations and so forth. And can you really explain that kind of thing with a political economy approach? Or do you need to sort of go deep into psychological factors of the self, the construction of the self as, conceived of in opposition to inferior non-white selves? So for me, white supremacy has the advantage in a sense of being agnostic and leaving these questions open. Though in particular contexts, if you are looking at in the capitalist system, then certainly you do want to see it as a racialized system. But white supremacy, for me, leaves it open that you could have a situation where post-capitalist systems remain white premises. Sorry, in other words, we can't sort of take for granted the sort of automatic, magical thinking that socialism is going to be this magic wand. It's going to sort of get rid of all forms of social oppression. And certainly in the case of gender, we have the history there to show that you can continue to have women being dominated, patriarchal forms of social organization under states regarding themselves as socialists. And arguably, this could be true for race as well. So white supremacy, for me, you want to leave it at a more abstract level, more sort of agnostic about what the explanations are, and then look at the world in an open-minded, experimental way, and say, what is the evidence, for the particular factors that bring this into existence, and could it be the case that a political economy explanation, which obviously most RPA members will be sympathetic to, is not going to sort of go all the way to be able to explain all the factors involved. You look at other kinds of explanation as well.
Well, I did think of two films to suggest very quickly. One, there's been a lot of really wonderful anti-racist films lately, but there's another one I just thought of, Best of Enemies. My favorites of the last few years is Boots Riley film, Sorry to Bother You. Not everybody saw, not as many people I think saw that as saw Get Out or some of the others. It's a wonderful film because it's one of the very rare films that has a labor action that focuses on the conditions of labor and race and class together, and has a labor action in it, and it's just brilliantly funny. The other movie that was very interesting that I think kind of got lost was Blind Spotting, with David Diggs and Raphael Casals. And what that movie does in a really interesting way is take up the question of white-black relations. These are two working class kids that grew up together, and they're both, into hip hop and everything, but they are positioned differently, and it plays out in very interesting ways in the movie. It's a really smart movie. The other movie that was not done very well, but it was based on a true story and a good book, is The Best of Enemies. And that's the story of C.P. Ellis and Ann Atwater, the grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan from Durham, North Carolina, who opposed integration of the public schools and then had a reckoning and a change of heart through his association with a radical Black militant in town, also working class like he was, Anne Atwater. And it's the movie's it's kind of a B movie. The book is better, but it's a true story. It's an absolutely true story. You can read about it in Studs Terkel and in the book The Best of Enemies. And it's a good story about class and race.
All right. Well, thank you both. Afraid that we've gone over time and we need to bring this to an end. I really want to express our appreciation for Linda and Charles for their thought-provoking presentations, and also want to thank our audience for so many good questions. I'm afraid that we weren't able to adequately deal with all of them. But I hope that you all did enjoy today's program. You should know that all of Global Justice's fundraising programs have been canceled due to coronavirus. Nevertheless, we continue to pay our Mexican staff. So if you can make a tax-deductible donation, please do so at our website. I want to give thanks to volunteers who helped in putting this program together. Betsy Bowman, Liz Mestras, Gregory Diamond, Roberto Robles, Coletta Mora, and Olivia Canales. But a special thanks to our two speakers today. This program, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube, accessible from our website, globaljusticecenter.org. Next week, we will have a very interesting program featuring Jerry Harris and Carl Davidson on the struggle for global hegemony, discussing the Green New Deal and a variety of related topics. And I think you'll find that a very provocative discussion. In following weeks, we will have a program on the war on Venezuela. There will be a webinar on socialism in the 21st century. Vicente Navarro, the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, will be talking on the pandemic has shown that the private system of funding medical care in the US is a disaster. So that and other programs, check our website where you'll see the full schedule of programs we have from now up through D-Day, November 3rd. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you for the invitation, Cliff.
And I'll sign off with my T-shirt.
Okay.